It's 1969 and the Cuyahoga River is in flames. Since the river fire wasn't Cleveland's central concern in 1969, we decided our work couldn't remain so narrowly focused. So our project evolved, inspired mostly by Carl Stokes, the mayor of Cleveland at the time of the fire, raised by a single mother in the Cleveland public housing complex. Stokes overcame his childhood poverty to a rapid rise into local politics to become the first Black mayor of an American city. He took office in 1967 and showed great promise for Cleveland's history. Circumstances forced Mayor Stokes to put out many fires as it was. In a city that was rusting, decaying, burning its way through what he called a crisis in urban environment. Stokes' expansive agenda included controlling water, air pollution, building public housing, improving safety, and also public health. Welcome to Tri-C's 2021 Earth Week. Carl Stokes and the Cricket River, the making of an environmental mayor. My name is Derek Williams, and I am a communication studies faculty here at Tri-C. And today I am joined with my students to talk about Carl Stokes and the 1969 Cuyahoga fire. Now, before we start, I would like to give an overview of our presentation to give context. We want to use our work and research to extend the current environmental movement as we know it. The scope of the environmental movement has taken a macro and looked at macro issues such as global warming, CO2 emission. We know that those are important factors, but what we would like to focus on is what we call micro issues. The micro issues that deal with a lot of things that residents in Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, Birmingham deal with. It's a concept called social weathering. That's our environment and all of the things that are in our environment that impact our health, our emotional state, and our social being. I can't think of no other greater example or metaphor to use than Carl B. Stokes' mayorship to provide that contextual lens. Now, today I'll be joined by some of my fabulous students, and these students have been working all semester on this presentation. The students will present segments of their Cleveland research presentation to give us a great snapshot and narrative of what we consider environmental justice. Attention to while the students are sharing their wonderful information. The first one is environment, and it's basically the circumstances, objects, and conditions by our surroundings. So we will be speaking from an environmental perspective. Second word, really important, is water. Colorless, transparent, also odorless, but it is the key sustainer of life. And then probably our most important word that ties this together is rivers. Bruce Springsteen, 1980s album, talked about the river and learning from the river. Sam Cooke's A Change Gonna Come. He starts out by saying he was born by a river in a little tent. So rivers are a stream where water flows in the likes, and it'll be important. Now, we want to contextualize this too, that we're talking and speaking from the Black African-American experience here in America. And we know that those three things that I just talked about, the environment, rivers, and water, all play a great part in our journey here. From the Flint water crisis to borders, Ohio, River being a border crossing from enslaved people down south to move up north, to the Birmingham Police Fire Department using water as a way to ward off civil rights movement and people during that time. And we also know that the Jordan River is a great metaphor in our spiritual journey, as well as the Atlantic Middle Passage, where so many Africans died from the voyage of West Africa to America. Dr. Martin Luther King once said, "Until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." This is important for our presentation today because Dr. King died in Memphis, organizing and supporting Black sanitation workers who did not even have the dignity to shower in the same facility as their white counterparts. And we know that this was an important thing for Dr. King, and he called it environmental justice. Dr. King traveled up north, and he took his fight up north in places like Chicago, in places like Cleveland, which we'll hear a little bit more about, and in Memphis and Birmingham. Dr. King was concerned about urban conditions or urban living conditions, or what we consider this environmental being. So environmental justice encompasses a lot of things. It deals with air pollution. It deals with toxic waste sites. Black and people of color live disproportionately by these things. Talks about lead in the home, as I just mentioned, lead in Flint, food deserts, inadequate housing. All of these things will be important when we get into our presentations. Now, the environmental justice movement started in the early 80s, and it started when Ben Chavis in a small town in North Carolina stood up to a waste site being dumped into their community, and they said no more. And they stood up and they fought. But to give us a little contextual or theoretical understanding when the students present, we have to go to what we call the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard. Dr. Robert Bullard grew up in Alabama, and he learned during his time in Alabama, growing up in the lower South, or what they call the Black Belt, that there were two Americas, and there were one community where toxic dumps weren't placed, and it was his community. And he said this about environmental justice. Environmental justice embraces the principles that all people, communities have a right, an equal right, equal enforcement of laws and regulations. And he talks about race. Race still matters and mapped closely with pollution, unequal protection, and vulnerability. Now, to help us undergird Dr. Bullock's work is a Cleveland native. Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington grew up during the time of the Carl Stokes mayorship, and she's gone on to become an environmentalist herself. And she talks about this thing, and you'll hear about it over and over, toxic segregation, where when we go to major cities, the segregation is very, 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 very rampant. The last person that we will draw from is none other than the incomparable Harriet A. Washington, who coins the phrase environmental racism based off the work of Dr. Bullock. Harriet Washington has this to say, that children who eat just a chip of lead paint, their IQ will be lower by 23 points. That is really significant, and we'll talk about that a little bit more today. Now, welcome to Carl Stokes, Carl in the Cricket River, the making of an environmental mayor. So let's get into our dynamic presentations from our dynamic students. The first student that we're going to hear from today is Arne Rogers, and she's going to talk a little bit about Cleveland as an industrial hub and the Great Migration.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arne Rogers. I attend John Hay Early College High School, located in Cleveland, Ohio, where I've lived most of my life, and I truly value equality. Speaking of mirroring the circumstances within other major cities across the United States, like Professor D said, including Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, and many others, the minority community within Cleveland, Ohio area has experienced severe economic racial disparities. To begin, I'm going to talk about the Great Migration, which is a period in United States history where around 6 million African Americans migrated out of rural southern states into urban cities of the northern states. And this started in 1916 and lasted through the year 1970. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the mid-1800s, lasting through the mid-1900s, had a crucial part in jumpstarting the Great Migration. It transformed economics from a rural-based industry to a factory-based. Mass production of new inventions, major companies, which led to more job availabilities. There were labor shortages occurring due to the lows of white men going to war, the First World War. This induced companies to lift whites-only hiring restrictions. These African Americans saw this abundance in employment opportunities as a blessing, so they took advantage of it, fueled by their urge to escape the intense oppression they faced in hopes of continuing their lives with more freedom, which was present in the North. The African Americans from the South surged into the Cleveland area, growing the Black population by around 60%. The Cleveland area was especially accepting because of their history of an abundant amount of abolitionists. The African Americans mainly settled in the area of what is now known as Fairfax, but they called it back then the Cedar Central or Cedar Woodland area. The more African Americans moved into the urban areas, the more white residents would start to move out to the outer areas of the city. The Cedar Central area started to become known as the ghetto, which would begin to move eastward as the white residents started to move to the outer areas, which became known as the suburbs. The white community in Cleveland, Ohio were not entirely happy to have African Americans serve into their communities, which became even more conspicuous when Black students started to be bused to the schools they attended. As a result, white residents began to migrate to the suburbs away from the new abundance of Black people, which became known as white flight. These prestigious neighborhoods developed tremendously, which would attract middle-class minorities as well who could afford them, like the houses in the suburbs. African-American residents would try to move to these new suburbs, like neighborhoods, but were confined within the Cedar Central and Cedar Woodland limits because of the increased discrimination and violence towards them. This became known as what we know as redlining, where homeowners and renting companies would deny house mortgage applications submitted by minority families in certain areas such as the suburbs. It also included banks refusing to lend minority families loans for houses they desire to buy within the suburbs. Property owners would create contracts called covenants between themselves and a potential buyer, expressing that property could not be sold to any person who was not of the white or Caucasian race. Maps such as these would be used to portray who could live in what areas and for how much. This occurred in suburbs such as Shaker Heights, Maple Heights, Forest Hills, and many others. The goal was to increase segregation by keeping minorities out of the suburban areas. Unfortunately, these attempts occurred everywhere in these major cities that we all know today. And this, unfortunately, was successful. It is evident through the large amount of minority families today living in poverty and struggling to find resources that will help them out of their struggling situations. The roots of the segregated city still show itself till this day. Thank you.
Thank you, Arne, for sharing that. Now I'm going to move to our next speaker because Arne has set the scene for Cleveland in the early 1900s on to the Great Depression. We see redlining take place. So our next speaker is Miss Jordan Wright, and she's going to talk about Carl Stokes and his family and how they grew up in these communities. So Jordan.
Hello, my name is Jordan Wright, and I'm a student at Cuyahoga Community College. My major is Associate of Arts and Social Science, and today I'm going to share with you some information about a groundbreaking man named Carl B. Stokes. Carl Burton Stokes was born June 2nd, 1927, in Cleveland, Ohio, to a family of three. He had a father named Charles Stokes, who worked as a laundryman, and his mother, Louis Stokes, who worked as a housekeeper. Louis and Charles Stokes were some of the many families part of the Great Migration from the state of Georgia to Cleveland, Ohio. And he also had an older brother named Louis Stokes, who soon grew up to become an African-American attorney. After his father died in 1930, Stokes, his mother, and older brother lived in one of the first public housing units called the Iowa Housing Projects. Stokes was very educated, but he had a rough start to his education. He dropped out of high school in 1944 and went to work in a foundry that same year. After, he went into the military and fought in World War II and served in the Army for almost 2 years. After serving in the Army, he decided to go back to high school and get his diploma in 1947. He soon attended several colleges, as such West Virginia College, then Cleveland College, and received his bachelor's degree in 1954 from University of Minnesota, and his law degree from Cleveland Martial Law School in 1956. He soon passed the bar in 1957. His political career started as him practicing law in Cuyahoga Community as an assistant city prosecutor in 1957 to 1962. He became a partner in his brother's law firm, Stokes, Character, and Terry, and there became increasingly involved in civil rights. In 1962, Carl B. Stokes became the first African-American Democrat in the House of Representatives for the state of Ohio. He served 3 terms and stayed involved in civil rights and welfare issues. He started to run for mayor in 1965. Unfortunately, he lost, but he did not give up. Soon 2 years
Okay, Jordan just got froze there. And as Jordan was just mentioning about Carl Stokes, she was basically sharing how Carl Stokes came into the election. In 1967, Carl Stokes would run a very close race where he would come up short. I'm sorry, 65, he would come up short, but in 67, he would taste victory. And we have Jordan back. Jordan, you can pick back up where you were. Okay. Jordan, can you? Yeah, go ahead, Jordan. Yep, you're fine.
All right. In 1962, Carl B. Stokes became the first African-American Democrat in the House of Representatives for the state of Ohio. He served 3 terms, stayed involved in civil rights and welfare issues. He started to run for mayor in 1965, and unfortunately, he lost. He did not give up, so he decided to go again. In 1967, he won the election and became the first African-American mayor of Cleveland. He also became the mayor of the people and government. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan, for sharing that wonderful take on Carl B. Stokes. So now that Arne has set the tone to tell us about the Great Migration, Black folks moving to Cleveland, Jordan, thank you for adding to that piece that Carl Stokes' family was part and parcel of that great migration and his historical election. The next thing we want to go to is to talk about Carl Stokes' time as a mayor. And we're going to talk about this in three facets. We're going to talk about a little bit pre-Stokes that looks at the Huff Riot of 66 up to 67. We're going to talk a little bit about the Glenville Shootout of 68. And we'll talk briefly about the 69 Cuyahoga River catching fire. Now, I would like to introduce my next speaker, Miss Anisha Young. And Miss Anisha Young is going to talk a little bit about the Huff riots. Anisha?
Hello, my name is Anisha Young, and just a few things about myself. I am 6'1". My favorite color is red, and I play the saxophone. A glass of water, killing 4 people, setting 240 fires through the neighborhood of Huff that then shaped the powerful leaders we know today. The abuse that became the forerunner to the Huff Riot. In 1966, the Huff community was 80% of Black people. The community became overcrowded with 72,000 people living in Huff from the Great Migration. This resulted in schools being overcrowded, leaving the youth with half of the education and overcrowding in housing. People of color had to endure daily abuse from verbal to physical abuse from white groups. They also had to endure police harassment and the abuse of their authority. The glass of water becoming the icebreaker. July 18th, 1966, a Black man went into the 79ers cafe and asked for a glass of water. He was then denied this glass of water, and this lit flames through the streets of Huff with a number of people growing outside the cafe. This led to looting and vandalizing through the streets. 4 people was murdered, 300 people was arrested, and 240 fires left millions of dollars in damages. July 20th, 1966, the National Guard was called to the community of Huff to restore order. This glass of water then shaped leaders to leave legacies behind. A year later, after the Huff Riot, Carl Stokes became mayor of Cleveland, and Fannie Lewis became the councilwoman over the community of Huff. Fannie Lewis fought for school vouchers, and so the youth can have better opportunities for education and for a better school. She also fought for housing, for them to rebuild the homes that was damaged due to the Huff Riot. Carl Stokes and Fannie Lewis saw a need to stop incorrect environmental justice that was affecting the community. Segregation, transportation, and overcrowding in school and housing had to be adjusted. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Ms. Young, for that powerful overview of Huff, giving us some more context to what Carl Stokes was dealing with during that time. As we said in our introduction, Carl Stokes had more flames going on in Cleveland than the Cuyahoga River, and we're just seeing this. So that is a great summation of the Huff riots and a true champion in Fannie Lewis. Now we would like to turn our attention to another neighborhood, and this neighborhood is Glenville. We heard from Arne, who named some of the communities due to redlining that Black folk, African-American people were delegated in. We're going to now hear from Mr. Charles Westfield, who is going to give us some information about Glenville. Charles?
There are riots going on across the nation. New York, Watts, Detroit, and even Cleveland. Hello all, my name is Charles Westfield. I study at Tri-C. I major in business administration, and I also graduated from Glenville High School. Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech at Corey Methodist church at Glenville, and he often visited Cleveland for 3 reasons. 1, Black Clevelanders supported Dr. King with the most money for bail during his arrest. 2, to focus on his northern campaign. And 3, because he supported Carl Stokes and wanted Carl Stokes to become mayor of Cleveland. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated, and in honor of Dr. King's legacy and his mission to address urban overcrowding, Carl Stokes was inspired to create Cleveland Now. Throughout the 1960s, the election of Carl Stokes, the first black mayor of a major city, helped calm racial tensions in Cleveland with Cleveland Now, which was a joint public and private funding program for the revival of Cleveland that was announced on May 1st, 1968. The plan for Cleveland Now was to raise $1.5 billion over 10 years, with $177 million projected during the first 2 years to fund youth activities, employment, community centers, health clinic facilities, housing units, and economic renewal projects. Funding goals were quickly met, but however, when the funds had indirectly gone to purchase firearms in the Glenville Shootout, donations declined. On July 23, 1968, police said that they were ambushed while Fred Evans insisted it was the police who shot first. According to witness William McMillian, one of the tow truck operators on the scene, reported that while exiting his truck, he was shot by a man holding a shotgun from the side of a house on Lakeside Avenue. Evans recounted differently and stated he was around the corner walking to the Lakeview Tavern when he heard one shot and saw McMillian running towards him, followed by machine gun shots, which killed one of his associates. The shootout lasted an hour, and there were 22 casualties, including 7 confirmed deaths. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Westfield, for sharing that. And one of the things that's really important that Mr. Westfield shared is that Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And when we even think about today and we see all of the shootings from the city that we're in, Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy who lost his life, and even up to the Sandra Bland, we see these countless things that are erupting. And this is from what we're talking about with the environmental justice piece that is bigger than just, again, the macro. It's the micro. It's the living conditions. It's being relegated to poor schools, dilapidated homes, lead in water. So these are the things that have erupted, as what Ms. Young so brilliantly articulated. The water was just the drop that sparked the flame. Now, we want to turn our attention to 1969. 1969 and the infamous Cuyahoga River catching fire. Next, we will hear from a military veteran, Mr. Lanier Carpe, who will talk a little bit about the 69 Cuyahoga River catching fire. Lanier.
Hey, my name is Lanier Carpe. I'm in the United States Army. Today I'll be lightly touching over the Cuyahoga River history, pollution, and the number of fires. The Cuyahoga River was a retreat from the last glaciers ever seen in the United States. It is called an infant river because it is young compared to all the other rivers formed by the glaciers. The river was formed about 13,000 years ago, but the Cuyahoga Valley has been even longer. The Cuyahoga River also had a great influence on Native Americans. The Native Americans called it Cuyahoga, meaning Crooked River. They came as early as 200 BC to the northeastern part of what is now the Ohio Valley. The Indians used the river mainly for food and transportation. They built canoes and fished along the river. These resources made it very easy for the Native Americans to live. The city of Cleveland was founded on July 22nd, 1796 by General Moses Cleveland, who saw the river to be a great communication network for commerce. In the mid 1800s, as Cleveland emerged as a major center for manufacturing, the river became heavily affected by industrial pollution, industry, and rapid population growth, made the river a flowing dump. There are many things being dumped into the river, such as gasoline, oil, paint, and metals. Raw sewage was also a big problem because it was directly being dumped in the river. The river became very flammable. At least 13 fires have been recorded on the Cuyahoga River. The most famous one occurred in 1969. Around then, Cleveland elected its first black mayor, Mayor Carl B. Stokes. Him and his congressional team Carl B. Stokes provided congressional testimonies on his and other major city struggles on pollution to restore the environmental health of the communities. Stokes and his utility director rallied votes to approve a $100 million bond to rehabilitate Cleveland's river. The fire sparked a media frenzy, which spurred an avalanche of water pollution control activities. The Clean Water Act, the creation of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, which you probably know as the EPA, and the Ohio Environmental Protective Agency, which you know as the OEPA. The Northeastern Ohio Sewer District has invested over $3.5 billion towards the purification of the river and the development of a new sewer system. The Cuyahoga River was designated as one of 14 American Heritage River in 1998. The river is now home to 60 different species of fish. There has not been another fire since the one that occurred in 1969. Thank you.
Thank you, Lanier, for sharing that great history about that infamous fire that led to so much positive policy change with Carl Stokes and his brother. Speaking of Carl Stokes and his brother, we're going to move to our last presenter, who is going to talk about the aftermath of the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire, Miss Marianne Hubbard. Marianne?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Marianne Hubbard. I am a jazz dancer, and I, like my family, like to use our platform to speak for people who might not have a voice within the community. Unfortunately, a lot of politicians in America have this demeanor where when it comes to civil rights or environmental issues, if it's not a benefit that can be quantified by a dollar amount, unfortunately, it's shooed away to find focus for something that's a little bit more self-serving for their campaign. However, Carl Stokes was a Cleveland native who vowed to make this change and change the narrative from the greedy politician to be a dedicated member to make our environment prosperous within the urban environment, despite all the odds, by gaining national awareness, in addition to change policy within our nation as well. As Lanier mentioned, the last fire was in 1969, and that damage totaled to about $50,000. It was extinguished in about 24 minutes. So compared to all the other ones in the past, it was less substantial and its damage that it created. Stokes argued that the urban environment of the city was not able to control the pollution within its borders due to Cleveland and its suburbs being acting as separate entities, much less having control over the state's legislations and regulations over pollution permit systems that affected the river and its constituents. In 1970, Carl Stokes was invited to testify before the Senate at a United States Conference of Mayors in regards to the Cleveland water pollution crisis. There, he urged the aid of federal government to clean and protect Cleveland's waterways. That same year, Congressman Louis Stokes and his brother as well appeared before the House of Representatives to secure money for the Cuyahoga River Cleanup Initiative. In 1968, Carl convinced all of his constituents to raise a total of $100 million in an initiative to help the sewer for upgrades, in addition to improve Cleveland's waterways. Monday, right after the fire of 1969, Monday, June 23rd, 1969, Carl organized a press conference, which would be known as the Pollution Tour. There, he invited all of the media to visit the site of the fire, one of the industrial sites that was located within the city that contributed to the damage of the waterway, and sewers that also contributed to the destruction of the river. From that press conference, an article in Times Magazine was printed on August 1st, which described the river to ooze rather than flows, which gave a perfect illustration of what was going on in our community at that time. In addition to that article, December 1970, National Geographic dedicated to its ecological crisis a commentary on the river, which included a fold out in the middle of it of an image of the river that had the oil slicks and just the debris that was washed up against the river shore. Unfortunately, they did not have the footage of the fire itself, so they had to use one of the previous fires that they had footage of that was a little bit bigger. And what it did pretty much was gain awareness nationally and help bring awareness to the issue that the river was creating within the community. Louis Stokes and Carl, they decided to, and had the access to revise the Clean Water Act of 1948, and that was officially signed into law in 1972. From all their work that they had did with media, with promotion, they were able to persuade Nixon at the time, who was our president at the time, to create the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which opened its operations in December 2nd, 1970. Shortly after, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District and the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency formed an alliance in 1972. This formation of the agency was meant for the sewers to be rehabilitated within the city and connected the city sewers to the sewers of the suburbs as well. Cleveland's first Earth Day, as well as the nation's, was April 22nd, 1970. This was to remind Americans not only of our duty to protect, but curate the land that we are given, because we're only given one. In the late 60s and 70s, the environmental movement focused mainly on water and air, but it left out the urban issues that Carl Stokes had meant to prioritize within his campaign. He voiced his concerns on the first Earth Day by stating, "I am fearful that the priorities on air and water pollution may be at the expense of the priorities of the country ought to be. Proper housing, adequate food, and clothing." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hubbard, for that fascinating overview. And to end, I would like to end our presentation with a quote from David Stradlin's book that looks at Carl Stokes and makes the argument that Carl Stokes was an incredible environmental mayor, thus our title. Stokes understood that environmental crisis existed well beyond the river, even but beyond the industrial smoke plumes that covered Cleveland. Stokes realized that the environmental crisis was inseparable from the broader decay of the city. I would like to thank my wonderful students who you all just saw display incredible talent. I am so fortunate to be their professor. I have the best job in the world, so I want to commend my students. I want to commend their parents and guardians for producing such wonderful, outstanding human beings who care about the planet. And they also care about the communities here in Cleveland. We would like to leave our viewing audience with one thing that they can do outside of being green and outside of recycling and those things. Those are important things. But as Arne said in the beginning, one of the greatest toxins in American culture is segregation. Cleveland, like so many other cities, is highly segregated. And it's a dual city. And there's a tale of two cities. And today, the students gave you a historical perspective, but a lot of those issues that they're talking about are still present today. We go to Flint, and the residents of Flint are still struggling with the water crisis. I would like to thank Ms. Arne Rogers. I would like to thank Ms. Jordan Wright, Ms. Anisha Young, Mr. Charles Westfield, and Mr. Lanier Carpe, and Ms. Marianne Hubbard. This concludes our presentation on Carl and the Cricket River, the making of an environmental mayor.